I think it's really quite extraordinary that we live in like a quote unquote post-truth society. And that, for example, has become a term that's just like thrown around and almost accepted. And it's like, what the can I swear here?
Of course.
Great. What the fuck? And what do you mean a post-truth society? How has that become something that we have just accepted?
I'm joined today by Rachel Donald. Rachel, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
Thank you very much for having me, Jesse.
I'm excited to get to ask you the question, why is the world in crisis?
Everybody does this to me on every panel, every podcast.
You brought it on
Really
yourself.
making me. I know. So I'm going to caveat the way that I always do, which is my answer to this question changes every day. That's the nature of this question. It's such a huge question. And I think at the moment, with my research, the conversations I'm having, the world is in crisis due to violence. And I really don't think we talk about it as explicitly as we should be. That we can kind of dance around with language and try and obfuscate the reality. But fundamentally, what's going on planet Earth right now is that there's more destruction than construction. And the construction of the human project is causing an exponential amount of destruction of the natural world, the web of life that we come to depend upon. And that's violent. It's fundamentally violent. But there's something really interesting about violence, in that it's actually really hard to talk about. And I think that that's because a core tenet of violence is that it destroys meaning. And so it becomes difficult to grasp what it is, what we're doing. Is it physical? Is it emotional? Is it spiritual? Who perpetrates violence? What is a victim of violence? How do we come to talk about it? And that speaks to another component of why I think the world is in crisis, and that's language. The fact that there's this kind of like human illusory net sort of like stuck onto material reality, and it's words. And words are, I mean, amazing. I'm a writer, they create sort of these nets to catch us in, and they create spells, and they make it possible to have dialogue like this. But also, if we forget the roots of where words come from, if we uproot them from the land, and if we uproot them from material reality, and if we uproot them from meaning itself, then they become a tool of obfuscation of material reality. It becomes very difficult to have an actual conversation about what is going on in the world. And I think it's really quite extraordinary that we live in like a quote unquote post-truth society. And that, for example, has become a term that's just like thrown around and almost accepted. And it's like, what the can I swear here?
Of course.
Great. What the fuck? And what do you mean a post-truth society? How has that become something that we have just accepted as fact almost? And what does that mean to live in the post-truth world? And how do we get back to truth? And was there a pre-truth world? And what is truth? And I really don't mean to be all like either postmodernist or Jordan Peterson mocking postmodernism, but really it's really important that we define terms, and that we also agree that there is an objective reality of the world, and that objective reality is material. And we must find a way to be able to speak about that objective reality with our language. And I'm going to leave you with a little note, kind of linking some of these parts. And it's a video I saw of Noam Chomsky. And it was filmed years ago, right? Like 12 years ago. And he's doing a tiny event at a university. There's literally like sort of 30 people in the room, and it's being filmed on, an old smartphone or an old camera. Like the quality's like 720p or whatever, and it's shaky because somebody's just holding it. And somebody asks him what he thinks of postmodernism. And his answer is astonishing. And he says, I suppose we must understand that if it's been allowed to flourish on university campuses in the way that it has, then it must be helpful to power in some way, or at least non-threatening. And this postmodernist arc that we live in which everything can be questioned, that was really helpful when we were deconstructing that objective reality is not the white male perspective. But how do we come through it and begin to actually construct what then is an objective reality that is diverse or pluriversal and that reflects the multitudinous reality that we live in, this web of life that makes it possible for us to be here? How do we do that with language? And I feel like until we figure out how to do that with language, we're going to keep violently destroying the world around us, because until we have a way to understand that, we won't have a way to value it. And until we have a way to value it, then we won't stop taking it and transforming it into waste, which is essentially the stuff of civilization.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
that's my short answer.
no, I love it. We're gonna double click on a bunch of that. Famous wordsmith T.S. Eliot said, "I'm never saying what I mean," and that existed in a pre-digital context, of course. Also, in the post-truth MIT Reader, I'm shamefully forgetting the author. He talks about postmodernism being weaponized first by the tobacco lobby in the US, but then, of course, anti-vax initiatives, like any kind of like anti-science initiative has its roots in both postmodern theory and the ways that it was weaponized by the tobacco lobby. I guess that leads me to a question of like, in the conversations you've had, in the reading you've done, are there any postmodern theories that have attracted you? Like, I know metamodernism is very popular. Like, it's funny for me as a humanities person, like metamodernism meant something a little bit different 10 years ago than how it's being used. But I guess like, as we're thinking about reconstructing possible like modes of meaning and consensus, like, are you seeing any theories proposed that are appealing to you?
Nah, not really. And that's not to say that they're not of value. I think that having also come from the humanities and come through a lot of this work through the humanities, I think I'm a little bit done now. There's an element of not being able to understand sentences written by the humanities. And again, I find that like a lot of the language when it comes to like constructing these theories of reality or whatever, it's just really complicated, and it's unnecessarily complicated. And I think that you can do the same thing with poetry much better. And so to me, it's like, what is there in poetry and music and art and film that's providing opportunities or possibilities or potentials for constructing different visions of the world? And I think that's really important, because none of these things attempt to build a grand theory of what should be or what could be, but rather, engage in a dialectic with the viewer, the reader, the listener. And the very act of being in relationship in that moment with a piece of art, the dynamic of that, this is what Heidegger wrote about. This is what differs art from an object like a chair, because it invites every single person into a relationship with it in and of itself. And that relationship is different for each person. The only thing that is certain is that there will be a relationship, and that speaks to the web of life again. And so I feel like art, poetry, music makes space for, again, the multitude, like the pluriverse, in a way that, trying to flatten hierarchies into lines and then twisting them around on each other so they kind of look like genomes, and, attempting to take all of that history of Western linear thought and make it into a cycle. I mean, well done if you can manage it, but that's not particularly where I'm looking. And just to finish on that, there's a lot of like indigenous scholarship and colonial scholarship, post-colonial, post-growth, all of that kind of scholarship that's actually kind of coming out a little bit of the humanities, but also out of economics, and to me, the very nature of that being a kind of interdisciplinary attempt is more exciting than just thinking about theories of society in and of themselves.
I love that. You brought up post-growth, and so I feel there's the obligatory question of like, there's degrowth, there's post-growth. Both have different proponents and detractors. There's a lot of like Venn diagrams. There's a lot of proposals. What's your overall take on those two terms? And just for folks who maybe haven't encountered them, if you could kind of like give your kind of one sentence definition or sort of understanding.
I don't know if I have a one sentence definition of post growth, but degrowth is the theory behind imagining a global economy of redistribution, of minimizing humankind's impact on the natural world in order to rehabilitate the natural world, whilst also providing all of the necessary qualities and infrastructure that human beings need to live a life of well-being. I think, from what I understand, post-growth is like the umbrella of that. Degrowth fits into that, but there's also different kinds of theories with regards to like, how do we make that more decolonial, or how do we make that circular or a donut or whatever. And great. I mean, I think they're great. I remember, at the beginning of it, I also had a problem with the term degrowth. I was like, no, it's not marketable, blah, 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 blah. Like, who cares? And it is making waves as well. Like, everybody says this, like, oh, degrowth, but everybody's talking about it. And there was like a degrowth conference at the European Parliament. So it's out there, and whether or not it's a good word or a bad word, it's a word that people know. And I think that the intention behind it is really great, really important. I think there's phenomenal speakers and writers and thinkers like Jason Hickel out there doing an enormous amount of work, essentially, to really push the envelope on this and to show that there are different economies that are possible. I do think that there's an element of like, how do I put this? I have a slight problem with using like UN metrics to determine what the quality of life is for all people everywhere. I think that's somewhere where like degrowth falls a little bit short and kind of reveals the sort of whiteness in its roots, maybe. But generally, overall, I think they're doing excellent work, and I'd encourage anybody and everybody to go and read Less is More by Jason Hickel to get a further understanding of it.
Hell yeah. Yeah, and kind of building on your point, the way that I sort of often try to frame it kind of in a quick way is like, degrowth is the vector and post-growth is the state. Like you use degrowth to kind of activate new ways of thinking and organizing. And the idea is to achieve a state of being post-growth, like being post, economic growth being the primary metric. And I totally agree with you that it's actually like words that are too marketable or too palatable actually end up kind of fizzling because they don't provoke enough kind of battles online. And I don't love that that's a state of discourse like through social media, but it is what it is in the sense that like the same thing is true with tech buzzwords like the metaverse and artificial intelligence means nothing ultimately. But a lot of people write meaning into what they believe or like what their version of AI is. And then you have a lot of people kind of like arguing whatever. And like, that remains, a prevalent concept for coming up on 70 years now. So
totally.
I mean, I couldn't agree more that it's actually the slight unmarketability or the kind of like the part that frustrates,
co-opt, isn't it?
What's that?
It's difficult to co-opt degrowth, isn't it? Like, what's neoliberalism going to do with degrowth?
Right. Like, what's the like I'm thinking of like the pink ribbon, like you can't like have a degrowth month or whatever if you're Exxon. You brought up the word pluriverse and pluriversal, and folks might not be familiar with that. So I just wanted to invite you to, if you could just give a quick sense of what that is.
Again, not an academic of these things, but the vibes that I get from these words are essentially creating a world in which many different modes of being are possible and celebrated and protected and championed. So pluriverse would be one, for me, I imagine one in which like Western hegemony is not the dominant train of thought around the world, one in which we have lots of different economies. Like, quite frankly, if somebody in some, corner of the world wants to go off and create a little capitalist hierarchy, fine, go off, do it. Like in a pluriverse, you can go off and do that. But you can't then sort of engage in wiping out all different other modes of organization in order to protect your own at the cost of everything else. So I think it's just about kind of like, it's a bit fractally, like reflecting the very ecosystem that is humanity, and that there's so many different ways of being, and within that also the more than human world, that they also need to be protected, and we fundamentally depend on them. And a pluriverse is one in which all species coexist to the benefit of all species.
Hear, hear. You referenced being a humanities person, and so I'd love to hear a little bit about your background. And it doesn't have to be that your humanities background if you don't want it to, but I'm curious, like, if there are formative experiences that you look back to as being like moments that, in retrospect, brought you to the position you are today.
So I grew up in a family of investigative journalists, and what that means essentially is that you grow up with a sense that things are not the way that people say they are. And that power is lying. We don't know about what, but power is lying about something. And so it kind of gave me this sense of like alienation, I would say, almost from the world. Like it was quite hard to be in the world. And my instinct was always to challenge it. And, studying the humanities was nice in that it gave me a lot of kind of connection to the world through, poetry and literature. But it was also frustrating because it was like, well, what does any of this mean? What's any of it going to do? I kind of had like a latent sense of things being on a precipice, I think intuitively and in my body, if not intellectually. And the humanities in a sense felt like a bit of a glass ceiling. And especially seeing just how we were in a particular moment in time whereby industry had really captured thought, like if you think about the kind of books that could change the world in the past, none that I will be able to reference now, thus totally undermining my point. But the fact that publishing houses are, run for profit, that there's essentially 5 that dominate, the Anglophone world, and that we know fine well that they tend to want to publish things that have kind of already been published. And it sort of felt like this, Baudrillard mimetic circle, or, the snake, eating its own tail. And it's like, well, how is art and music and poetry ever going to be able to do anything at scale if it kind of can't get through the door? And also I find it really boring to kind of like talk a lot about literature of the past when I find there's so much amazing literature being written now. Like, why are we not talking about these people? Like, surely there's young people that universities could be platforming, by introducing their books or whatever, like debut authors. But no, we had to look at like Shakespeare. Who cares? Oh my God. So my education was mixed, and my experience with my education was mixed. But I did get introduced to philosophy in my sort of final years, and then invited to, God, nobody knows this, I never said this publicly, I was invited to do a master's in Switzerland at this like quite radical school that had been set up by a German philosopher who essentially just couldn't get a job anywhere in the United States because he was such a pain. He was brilliant. Like, he had debated with Heidegger back in the day, but he wasn't a pain. And essentially what I saw there was a lot of brilliance, a lot of using language to reveal the world and also hide the world. But I also saw a lot of illusion. I remember being very disappointed when I found out that my left-wing professors were getting paid in cash. or the amount that they were getting paid. I found it very disappointing that there was all this kind of like talk, of revolution, but watching them day by day over lunch and dinner, essentially this summer school was a place for them to come and hang out for the summer and just see old friends. And yeah, we were getting a kind of stellar education, but materially, what was the impact, And it just, again, it was that sense of like just everything being captured. And I think this was really the sense that I had through my 20s that was so upsetting, was like, if I wanted to be like down and out, like Orwell as a writer, where could I go in Europe anymore where I could do that? Everything was so expensive. You can't go and rent a room for a tuppence or whatever it was and have like, the hotel owner, this old woman, like bring you, your breakfast every day in pressure clothes, and I'll do it for like a tiny fraction, and, there'd be rats everywhere or whatever. Like you couldn't live on the edge. It just felt like there was just this closing in of possibility, and I found it so frustrating because I wanted to be on the edge of something. I wanted to feel real, and I wanted to feel like I had an element of choice, and I wanted to feel like there were other possibilities open to me, and it really just didn't feel like that. And so I was like, well, if I'm not going to get it doing an education, like that old school style of like doing a PhD and having genuine conversations and like feeling like you're really getting to something, that didn't seem possible anymore. So I was like, right, well, that's off the table. I can't be a bum, down and out writer, because nobody can afford to do that. And so I did sort of the next thing that felt logical, which was go to a place where I didn't know the language, because that was a feeling of being on the edge and having to learn a culture kind of like a newborn babe, essentially. And I just kept up my own education. I, started reading about economics and reading more about politics, and I kept, writing as well for myself. And essentially was thinking about systems, but I didn't have a word for it, And then fast forward a couple of years, and I had this idea for I wanted to start the world's first sustainable publishing house. And in the process of, trying to figure out how to do that almost broke my brain. And when I crawled out of the other side of it, because it's impossible, like it's actually impossible to do something authentically sustainable right now, essentially at scale. And so when I crawled out the other side of that, being like, oh God, it's everything is geared against this possibility, I decided to start a podcast. And here we are 4 years later. And it's funny, I finally have that feeling that I always wanted, which was genuinely learning with every conversation and pushing the envelope with conversation and writing to an audience of people that aren't kind of policed by this third party between me and them dictating, what cultural norms or trends should be. And this sense of like being on the edge and it being frightening, because we're talking about the collapse of civilization, but also it feeling like riding a tidal wave, and it's thrilling. It's totally thrilling to be able to be there at this moment in history in a community of like-minded people and essentially bearing witness to what's happening, even if we can't do very much about it. And I'm deeply grateful for it. And I'm not sure if that answers your question. So
no, absolutely.
It's helped, but
absolutely. As somebody who started a podcast with one title and changed it midway through, or not midway through, but early-ish on in the process, when did you know that you wanted the show to be planet critical versus platform enterprise?
Oh God, you really did your research, didn't you? Yeah. So Platform Enterprise was the name of was the business name that I'd registered for the publishing house. So that was why it was that. And essentially it was Platform Enterprise because platform was taken. And I wanted it to be this sense of platforming, this sense of community and like, raising other voices. And I had no idea what I was doing, and I had absolutely no strategy other than just, if I say I have a podcast, people will talk to me. And then At the same time, I was producer of Radio Free Sarawak, which was the only independent radio station in Malaysia producing news for Indigenous people about the fight to save their forest and corruption, political corruption, financial corruption, the ties between industry and government. And I was seeing firsthand the impact of the climate crisis, how logging essentially had changed the microclimate, and there was more heavier rains and flooding, and the earth couldn't drag the water down into it because the ecosystems had been torn up essentially. And so there'd be flash floods, and every month more flash floods than ever before, and they were washing away entire villages and kids were drowning. And it was this incredible sort of amalgamation and nexus of all of these different factors: extractivism, capitalism, because the political community was looking away because they needed the timber that was coming out of Malaysia, climate change, indigenous rights, human rights, and it was all there. And so I was seeing that, and then I was having these conversations about capitalism on the podcast, and then I interviewed Steve Keen about the economics of climate change, and he painted out how it is that our economies are driving climate change. And I was like, well, there you go, that's it. Like, I want to study that nexus. And originally, when I first decided to change from Platform Enterprise, I wanted to call the podcast The Economics of Climate Change. Thank God I didn't, because there's bigger systems as well at play. Economics is not the only thing. And I was on a train going to see my friend and her little 6-month-old baby at the time, and just running through, names in my head, and then Planet Critical. And I just had that feeling in my bones of, oh yeah, that's it. Don't know what it means, but that's it.
Well, it's a great name.
Thank you.
Very, very resonant. Love the logo.
Thank you.
Climate corruption journalist. So I can't remember if you said this on a podcast or I read it somewhere, but you are the first, if not hopefully the only anymore, climate corruption journalist. You coined that term. I guess as a kind of opener, do you view that experience in Malaysia as being where you sort of forged the idea of climate corruption journalism?
100%. Yep. I find it really interesting that there's always this noun in front of corruption. So people will be like political corruption journalists or financial corruption journalists, rather than just corruption. And that's probably because there's so much. You really do have to pick a niche, essentially. And to me, it was just a really good nomer, essentially, for pointing out that there's all of that corruption is driving the climate crisis. And, there's a poetics to it as well, which is that our climate has been corrupted, which is why, the planet is warming. I don't know if people get it, but I've never had somebody be like, I've had people be like, ooh, what does that mean exactly? But mostly people are like, nice. And again, I think there's just an element of like, people know that there's a problem with the climate, and people know that there's a problem with corruption, and people know what a journalist is. So, even if they don't get it exactly, they know that it's a thing and that it should be around. So yeah, I made it up and I'm the first, and I would love many other people to either come up with a better name or adopt it.
Yeah, no, there's a lovely, sort of double valence to it. With the climate being corrupted and then the people doing the corrupting. There's been I want to sort of push in a little bit on the sort of the ways that independent journalism has been really fruitful for you, and then also talk about some of what you maybe don't get that you get when you sort of work with an editor at a sort of mainstream publication. And to do that, I think it would be helpful to jump off from, you have two stories that seem to have gotten a lot of attention semi-recently within the past year. And one is about Gaza, and the other was about Elon Musk election fraud, election tampering. And just observing the comment sections on both of those, there's just like so much there. And of course, you're just like one person navigating that. So like, one, if you could share sort of more detail about those stories, but then two, talk about like how your thinking was playing out and what you were learning, and like, whatever insights you were gathering about being this sole person doing this type of work versus doing it under the aegis of, you know, a corporate machine, like, you know, a mainstream media outlet.
So, one of the problems that we're facing today with regards to journalism is that there's a lack of trust, and rightly so, from the public towards a lot of the media. And that is in part due to, you know, some sort of flagship shows using the language and the identity of being news shows when really they're not. Such as Fox News. And the guy who sort of co-launched that with Rupert Murdoch wrote a book about it and said that explicitly. You know, we were faking news, essentially. So what that means is that journalists aren't really allowed to be experts anymore. It's really rare that a journalist will stay on a beat for a long time and be an expert in a topic. And that is also in part due to this expectation, this very old expectation that journalists be objective, quote unquote, and unbiased. And despite the enormous amount of research that has come out in recent decades from academics studying journalism and showing that it is impossible for a human being to be objective and to be unbiased, that is still the kind of like drum, essentially, that is meant to separate like good journalism from fake journalism or bad journalism. And obviously that only really serves to help power itself, because, you know, the bad journalism will actively promote power and the good journalism will hold power to account if somebody else has said a quote that they can then quote, because the journalist must not be seen to be doing it, because if they are seen to have a bias, then how could you trust their reporting on anything? Just a little caveat. I think what's really interesting about that is you create situations whereby people are expected to not report on things that are dear to them, such as, you know, we've seen a lot of kind of Muslim journalists be fired in the wake of Israel committing a genocide in Gaza, because they were seen to sort of be unable to report on that objectively. And it's like, well, who is better to report on that than people who have lived experience, for example, of that conflict, of that persecution, who can report on the culture? And obviously it just creates a scenario whereby ultimately the political identity that will be able to report on anything is the white male, because it's the white male who is least impacted by any of the prejudices in the world, although increasingly there are prejudices against the white male. So it just, again, it all serves to kind of like support and help power. What I do now is focus on systems reporting, essentially, as a climate corruption journalist. So I'm not interested in like details, essentially. I won't look at just one company or just one event. I will always zoom out as much as possible to try and look at like, what are the invisible forces here that are driving this? Economic, geopolitical, material. Because of the information that I've got from interviewing all of these experts, hundreds of experts over the years, about how materials and energies going to drive our economies, and then these economic drives essentially create these geopolitical relationships. When Israel invaded Gaza, I was like, well, what else is going on though? You know, because it's just too easy. It's too easy that October 7th is sort of the reason when Gaza's been an open air prison, essentially, a concentration camp for decades. Israel is allegedly, you know, has the most secure border in the world. How was it that Hamas got through? How was it that they got through unnoticed for 4 hours? There were lots of bits of it that didn't make sense. I'm not saying I have the answer to those bits, but it was enough for me to be like, yeah, what else is going on here? And I found two things really, really interesting. The first was that it was so quickly decried as like a religious war, essentially, or a cultural war, which ensured that, one, it was pigeonholed as something that was like particular to the two players, you know, Palestine, or Hamas rather, and Israel, and also meant that, you know, it was kind of difficult to comment on, or if you were to comment on it, then the conversation would essentially descend into vitriol very, very quickly, which is what we saw all over the news, all over the Western world. So I was just on Twitter one night, going through, you know, different tags like Gaza, Palestine, Israel, whatever, and I found this tweet. And it was a guy that was saying, oh, this is a really interesting UN report around the gas off the coast of Palestine. And I was like, ooh, that's interesting. And I read the report. And the report clearly stated that since 1991, the Palestinian Authority has been trying to exploit the gas, explore and exploit the gas off of its coast. That successive Israeli governments have either worked with the Palestinian Authority to do that, typically when they're left wing, or killed the deal in order to do that. The UN reporter showed that it's $500 billion worth of gas. It's actually quite a large gas field, the Leviathan gas field. And that prior to an invasion, previously, I cannot remember the year, excuse me, but we know from records that Israel essentially delayed a ground invasion of Palestine until the Inc. had tried with an oil company to go and explore that gas. And the UN was looking into it because they were saying this is a phenomenal resource which could be developed in partnership, not but just between Palestine and Israel, but all of the neighbors as well, because it's in the sea, so it also belongs to other people. And this could be a way to develop the Palestinian economy, essentially. So that was where I got a lot of my data, and then, pooled essentially from other bits of data on the internet, and wrote a piece that was built from the information that was in the public domain already. And that essentially said, Israel's been trying to get their hands on this gas for ages. It's been a couple of weeks since they've invaded. We already know that there were reports that morning that a bunch of oil companies had, essentially lobbied to get the rights to explore it. And that Israel was in the middle of a war, had the time to go off and do that. And I wrote a piece that joined all those dots and then asked questions, what's going on here? What do they want to, is this also connected with the fact that Europe has lost Russia's gas supply since the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up? And so is this why they are also supporting Israel's invasion? Because it means that their partner, who they signed a memorandum of understanding to get gas from a few months prior, is going to be able to supply them with fuel through the winter. Not that winter, but just generally speaking. And so, it went viral because it made sense to a lot of people that, maybe there's more going on here. Because I think the public is really starting to get sick of their political leaders attempting to paint anything happening within the Middle East as simple and as not to do with resources. Like, we've learned our lesson over and over and over again. We know that it's to do with resources. And my bias is that every conflict is to do with resources. And resources don't just have to be natural or material. They can also be like women's bodies, that act as the mode of cultural reproduction. Because that's how economies grow. And economies need to grow. They cannot just stay stagnant. They have to be in this kind of dynamic with the world. So they have to be growing or degrowing. Hopefully one day we'll reach a kind of cycle where within a fairly small kind of margin, they'll just grow and degrow and grow and degrow. So there's this scramble at the moment to get hands on resources all around the world because we are running out of oil in available fields. Shale gas kind of stopped the oil crash in the 80s, but that's kind of being used up, certainly in the United States. And whoever controls the energy source controls the power, because that's what fuel is. It is power. So that's the bias with which I see every single conflict around the world. And that's why I cannot get it published in papers, because there was not a person going on record to say, you can join the dots this way. It was me finding all the dots and saying, you can join the dots this way. And it was antithetical to the news agenda at that time, which was to paint it in a very black and white, simplified way. I find it fucking fascinating that story has not been picked up by major newspapers. Russia Today covered it. But not a single major newspaper has read that piece, covered that piece. And I know that they've read it because I sent it to them and said, this is getting 500,000 views. Would you like to cover it? So I can understand that editors in a newsroom would go, this just isn't tight enough, say. But then you could have somebody write an opinion piece, or with that information, you could go out and get people on record to say that thing. Or you write a piece where you have question marks instead of full stops. Like, there's lots of ways to do this, and it's very interesting that it's not been covered. With regards to the election fraud story, that's slightly different. I was contacted by a fellow journalist in the United States that said, can you please look into this? I'm not sure if it's just me attempting to cope with the result, but, there's this guy that's saying something went on. Do you think something went on? And so I had a look at the data, and it was no. I had a look at what he was saying about the data, and it was pretty compelling. And I got him on the phone, and I said, tell me the story, start to finish. My little, journalistic antenna was a little bit like, this guy really likes the spotlight. I can see that. But I was aware that we were on a deadline, essentially, to publish allegations of fraud in the election, because I think it was the end of that week was the deadline for people to essentially put in requests to do hand recounts in certain states. And so I made the editorial decision as a little independent journalist to write a piece that used question marks instead of full stop and leaned heavily on the word alleged. Sadly, we don't have very high media literacy. And so that piece really went around the world as like, this is election fraud. And so I had to follow up the following week and say, I didn't get my hands on the data. The source has now disappeared and won't answer my emails. Some of the public data that I've gone through does not suggest that, his theory stands. He has since kind of debunked his own theory and said, it wasn't actually that, but it was this. So, you're all going to have to forgive me essentially for behaving like an independent journalist, which was I have the flexibility to take a hit essentially, possibly legally, and lean heavily on the word alleged just in case this is true. And I didn't take the fall in any way. I was like, the piece is tight. There were question marks instead of full stops, and there was the word alleged. We do have a problem with media literacy. But essentially was like, I go out on a limb to do my work as this kind of systems reporting and to report on the stories that mainstream journalism won't cover. And this time the limb broke from underneath me. And my community were very generous with me. They were really grateful that I'd written a follow-up, sort of debunked my own story and been accountable. So overall, it was a very nice experience.
That's good to hear. I also think that you're really hitting at something critical, pun intended, where we do need people with either journalistic inclination. So there's a whole kind of raft of independent journalists who don't have traditional journalistic training, but who still are asking the right questions and sort of oriented correctly. In your case, you are trained as a journalist, and we need folks like you who, instead of trying to default to like some other source saying the thing, as you say, we need subject matter experts or people who are able to go just say the thing using the language of journalism to say it. And it seems decreasingly likely that can happen in corporate media. And I'm not somebody I sort of cringe every time I say mainstream media because there's a lot of right-wing kind of baggage associated with that. And even within corporate media, there's tons of really hardworking journalists, and B, it's kind of like you have to know the beast you're dealing with, and you have to know the categories where you're going to get more accurate, honest coverage and more kind of coverage that's been sort of leaned in particular directions. And that's true across the board. I obviously have my political biases and frustrations and whatever, but it's almost like that moment with the election fraud story, I'm glad you ran with it, even if the data didn't end up supporting it. And, obviously you covered your bases with the kind of allegedly and with the question marks, but somebody has to be able to be the person proposing those ideas and be wrong sometimes, or point people in the wrong direction sometimes. That's kind of the price of admission if you want people who are going to also then be able to get it right, as it seems you have with the Gaza story.
Yeah. I want to agree with you intellectually. Emotionally, I find it difficult. That was sort of my first, not ever, But that was my first time striking out, and essentially it being not watertight, or the source not being a good source. And I was really worried in that moment. Like, I've spent 4 years building up a reputation. I've published world exclusives in major newspapers, and now on my own platform, I've covered the genocide in Gaza, the genocide in Sudan, the geopolitics that are driving those genocides. And have I undone that work for this story, which was not a story that is normally in my wheelhouse? Like, it was a single event and it was a single source, and that is not normally what I do. So I see where you're coming from, but in a sense, I think I kind of learned my lesson of like, I'm going to stick with what I have built my reputation to do, which is the systems reporting, and stay away from these kind of like, individual incidents. I think you could classify that as, and I was very grateful to my community for kind of understanding the thoughts behind it. And I do think there's a place, as you said, for people to kind of stick their neck out or make suggestions. A lot of good journalism actually back in the day was done that way, where you would publish a piece asking questions and pointing to things and not making any accusations, but essentially inviting readers to see a big picture or to come to a certain conclusion. And what that would do is either flush sources out of the woodwork for to corroborate what is blindingly obvious, but you need somebody to corroborate it. Or it would panic whoever you were looking at, and in their haste, they would make a mistake, essentially, and reveal themselves. And so I do think absolutely there is space for that kind of work. And I would really love to see more of it coming out of corporate media. Like, it's not a journalist's job. I mean, and this is using their own framework. It's not a journalist's job to know anything. It's a journalist's job to ask questions. That's why we're not asking questions in public.
So yes, but I think the thing that I confront as somebody who, like, kind of similar to you, there's only been one moment that I worked full time as a journalist, but mostly my entire journalistic career has been kind of in and out and doing other things. And a lot of the best pieces I was able to write were because I was embedded in a community, but not in an oppositional way per se, like the way we think of like the classic kind of like gonzo journalism, sort of this expose sort of orientation. My genuine belief is that we're in a moment where a journalist does have to have enough literacy and enough subject matter expertise to be able to connect the dots appropriately. Like, our systems have complexified so thoroughly, and there's so much going on in the public sphere now with platforms like Twitter that, like, I don't know how you would, and that's sort of what makes the sort of job of journalism so difficult at this juncture, is like, I don't know how you could cover, like, one beat near and dear to my heart is like surveillance and ad tech. I don't know how you would meaningfully cover that without essentially spending all your time in that community, either digitally or in person, because there's so much going on, so many players, so many ways that language is manipulated and sort of used to say what it's not saying. So it's this balance of like, how do you become a subject matter expert and report on the community that you inevitably have to in some way be part of? And I think I don't have an answer for that. I just recognize it as one of these potentially unfortunate realities of journalism right now.
I totally agree with your analysis. And I think that it is, it's critical that journalists get a little bit smarter, a little bit more educated on what they want to write about. It's amazing the stuff that like slips through the cracks. Like, after Assad's regime fell, the New York Times published this little piece by, I think, probably a columnist, but essentially saying like, oh, there wasn't an oil shock in the markets. This is really great because essentially, Syria is not going to develop its oil, and hopefully that'll pay for the reconstruction of the country post-Assad. And it's like, what? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? Do you know it? First of all, do you know anything about how relationships between like newborn governments and massive oil corporations typically work, especially in the Middle East? Like, it's going to be BP or Total or some Western company that goes in there and exploits that and takes the vast majority of the money out of it. Because that's why Iraq's not been rebuilt, despite the fact that its oil fields have been exploited, in the decades essentially since that war. Because of the nature of the power dynamics between giant corporations, especially fossil fuel corporations, and budding little governments. So dumb. And then also, hello, the planet's on fire. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? How dare you talk about exploiting oil without talking about climate change? And how dare you talk about exploiting oil as if it is an adequate way to develop an economy? And how dare you talk about development without talking about the fact that there's bloody trillions sloshing about the global economy doing nothing? That we could rebuild Syria out of the goodness of our hearts, quite frankly. So it's just one of these things that looked really professional and knowledgeable on the surface, but was just a pile of shit. And that was in the New York Times, So yes, I think there's a phenomenal lack of subject expertise, and not just subject expertise, but complexity expertise or historical expertise, geopolitical expertise, systems expertise. People are just not taught to think that way. They're not even taught to think that way at university. So this isn't a kind of tirade against journalists for their kind of moral failures. Everything is built to stop us connecting the dots, even the people who are paid to connect the dots. But I do think now that there's enough of us kind of independent journalists sort of piercing, the public consciousness that they should also be paying attention. I see you, BBC journalists and Financial Times journalists and every other journalist that subscribe to Planet Critical. I see you reading everything I write. Come on, let's collaborate. Go and do something like that on your site.
Speaking of divisive and differently covered events, and also so there's a kind of a mush of things that all fit. So I'm gonna kind of just throw it your way. Great, and you respond as you want. So this is kind of bringing together the connecting the dots, Luigi Mangione, and the nature of activism and sort of your take on all of that. Mm-hmm. And also you brought up violence as why the world is in crisis. And so thinking about the evolving role and understandings of violence that we're seeing kind of prismatically kind of refract throughout global society.
Where do you want me to start?
Maybe let's start with Luigi and we'll go from there.
About the piece that I published this week?
Yeah.
So I remember when that CEO got shot. I don't get up early, but I'm not based in the United States. So I remember seeing the news roll in the afternoon. And I remember that thrill of excitement of ooh, is it happening? Is it starting? Are people gonna, are we gonna French this situation? Guillotine, the problems. And that was a very emotional impulse, essentially. This idea of the public fighting back. And, and then when they couldn't find the guy, the shooter, and that also being a massive, middle finger up to the system, one of the most surveilled corners in the world, and they couldn't catch this guy, and, he leaves a decoy backpack, and it was just sort of all kind of felt like a movie. It felt like this kind of massive heist against, extractivism, essentially. And similarly, the public really ran with that emotional impulse. The killer, praised online, sort of championed, and there was a lot of talk of is this going to be the moment that sparks the revolution? And I chose not to write on it for a couple of weeks because I don't want to write emotionally only, essentially. And I don't mean that I don't want to write emotionally, but there's a whole bunch of other factors at play when it comes to sort of figuring out what your moral guide star is. And I needed to really sit with it. And I had a conversation with a friend who was it is disgusting that people are championing murder. We cannot forget that it is murder. Whether or not this person was a bad person, whether or not they did bad things, whatever. It is murder. And essentially, the conversation that we then had was about the fact that, like, championing the murder of this person only serves to obfuscate from the fact that this person may not have been immoral or whatever. They were just really good at doing the job that they were paid to do, because there's a whole system of forces acting upon all of us all of the time. And most people are too either cowardly or not particularly conscious enough to, like, go against the grain, or like change their lives or attempt to change other people's lives. That's not to say that bad things didn't happen, or that even evil things didn't happen. But it's too easy to divide the world into good and evil when we live in these sort of really complex systems. So I guess the thing that kind of worried me was, like, this sort of, like, leftist potential for apologism when it suits us. I've had arguments with people about Stalin. At the end of the day, if he could have only pulled it off, it's like, fucking, he was killing loads of people. What are you talking about? Like, it's not okay just because it was done, in the name of a political ideology that you agree with. And how do you expect anybody on the right wing to ever take us seriously if we're so quick to throw out our ideals when it comes about, when the end is in sight? Because this is the thing for leftists, right? The end is never in sight. We're always this, like, low-hanging fruit, and, the long night of the soul. My God, the future, the utopia feels so far away. And then you catch a glimpse of it and we're all like, fuck the morals, run, let's get there. And it's like, well, nobody's, ever going to take us seriously if that's what we do. And also, we're no different, really, from anybody else. If United Healthcare was okay with killing lives in order to save the bottom line, then how is that any different from killing a life in order to send a message, or, I don't know. And I think it's important to say we don't know who the killer was. It's Luigi Mangione that has been arrested for it, but he's pleading not guilty, and we may never know the motives behind this murder. So I wrote a piece that was essentially about, there's another way of looking at this. Murder is a really entitled thing to do, and entitlement is one of the most dangerous forces that is shaping the world around us. It's entitlement to kind of abuse the natural world that, facilitates this justification of extracting from it and turning it into, the stuff of civilization, and then shitting out the waste in some other corner that we cannot see. It's entitlement that drives sexual violence. There's hard sociological data on this. And I think it's very dangerous that a single person think themselves entitled enough to attempt to change the world in isolation from any community with whom they can have that conversation, and then also take a life in order to do that. Is that not a mirror of the same violence that we on the left decry? Because conversations about the future need to be had collectively, in tandem. And conversations about violence and self-defense need to be really clear. I'm all for self-defense. Somebody comes at you physically, kill them in that moment. But don't go out and decide that somebody is an emblem and take their life when it's actually not going to do anything to change the system. And that is evidenced by the fact that United Healthcare had their 9 a.m. meeting just 2 hours after their CEO was shot, because the wheels keep moving. Extractive capitalism doesn't even care about its best capitalists. That's the very nature of the beast. And I just, I felt that kind of got lost in the conversation around it. The fact that it was a murder, the fact that it wouldn't achieve anything on the grand scale, and the fact that, if it was Luigi Mangione, then it was a young, white, privately educated, probably quite entitled young man who wrote a manifesto, if it was his manifesto, that said, he was the only person in the world to confront the hard reality of the system. What an outrageous thing to say. What an outrageous, if that's the true manifesto, classic, quite frankly, to come from the mouth of, or the pen of a young person. And I don't think it's those young people who should be making the world in their image by themselves, especially with violence. We all need to be making the image of the world that we decide upon together without violence.
How do you square that with there needing to be some type of radical flank?
I mean, I think Andreas Malm is really clear in his book that the radical flank engages in sabotage. Like, blow up the pipelines, destroy the building, break the windows, even round people up, like in the Ministry for the Future, where essentially Davos is, everybody in Davos is sort of taken hostage for 3 days, and like they're never going to get killed, but it's just like, oi, you're not you're not totally protected by everything that you've built. Just a warning. I'm all for that, and I think this is why it's really important to have this conversation. And this is what people in my comments were kicking off about this, and it's like, Andreas Malm never calls for violence. He goes to great lengths to essentially liberate the left from an understanding of non-violence as wholly kind of aphysical. He says sabotage against private property is not the same as violence, because if you believe that it's the same as violence, then you're falling prey to this essentially capitalist and patriarchal perspective that private property is due the same rights as human life or any other life, biological life, when it doesn't. And so it's really important to actually engage in physical sabotage against private property, to undo that constantly, that belief, and to understand that it's not violence. Violence is against life itself. And so, the radical flank is welcome. Come along, do whatever you need to do. But I don't think any academic is saying that the radical flank engages in violence against human lives. And that it is so important to distinguish violence, sabotage, and self-defense.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate these points. And I actually don't disagree with any of them. I do also have other ideas that I think diverge.
Go on.
Like, there's something that evil people have really figured out, which is it takes a small number of individual stakeholders at the very top, at the decision-making position within a given system, to bend those systems to their will. And the one thing that I've really been thinking about post, if it was Luigi Mangione, his alleged murder, is the ways in which CEOs within the Western world, but particularly in America, suddenly having to confront the idea that their individual safety might be in danger if they are undertaking forms of structural violence through the work of their respective companies. I'm not entirely sure that there's ways other than physical violence to achieve that type of fear. It doesn't necessarily mean that it would have had to be murder. Like, it could have been other forms of violence. And to be clear, I am a pacifist. So like, anything that I'm talking about violence as being useful is exclusively under the auspices of, we are in a host of us in failing democracies where I expect violence to be occurring in structural or sort of personal forms. So I guess I want to pose that question to you, is like, do you think there are other ways of influencing these people that otherwise feel very untouchable at the psychological level? Like, at the psychological level of like, just take a step back and like, look at what the offering or lack thereof of your company is. Look at the ways that it is making money, the systems that it's participating in. And are those things likely to cause people to become desperate enough that violence seems like a plausible action for them to take?
Well, this is a difficult question to answer because we have a different understanding of the reality of the systems, I think. Because I don't think evil people are bending systems to their will at all. I think that people, in positions are doing the job that they have to do. Otherwise, they will be replaced. And they might very well enjoy it. And maybe some of them are totally fucking immoral. I'm sure a bunch of them really, really are. But I think it's like the very odd and unusual type that, like, Elon Musk, for example, who's like, oh, if I just press this and this and this and this and this button, then, I can make X happen, like get Donald Trump elected. But we're always moving in that direction anyway. So I don't think there's much that these people can do. And that's been a really tough realization. I don't think that people in power actually have much power, because if they were to begin to act in an empowered manner and actually behave differently and innovate in a genuine sense, then the way that the system is sort of mimetically constructed is everything would conspire essentially to disempower that person. Like Elon Musk is only powerful in Elon Musk because he remains Elon Musk. If Elon Musk tomorrow starts talking about the redistribution of wealth and maybe moving away from private EVs and onto, public transport, he will no longer be Elon Musk in the way that he is today. And I think that's really, really, really important when we understand like the distribution of power. And I think it speaks to what Baudrillard wrote about in Simulacra and Simulation, in which we will get to a stage in society where there is no power. It's only the illusion of power. And the final reason I think that's so important is because it allows for empathy, even in the darkest moment. It's not saying that you have to forgive people, but rather than seeing people as these kind of like amoral, evil, psychopathic characters, you can begin to look upon them as cowardly and weak and even not particularly intelligent. There was a really fascinating article in The Atlantic, I think like 7 or 8 years ago, which was about tech millionaires building bunkers around the world. And essentially all of them were saying, I'm doing this because it looks like everything's going to go to shit. And the journalist was like, well, why don't you do something about it going to shit? And they were like, well, I can't do anything. Well, what would you expect me to do? I can't do anything. And when I've been in conversation with incredibly wealthy people, it's the same thing. They genuinely think that they can't do something. And so we have to understand that like the nature of the system is acting upon all of us all the time in the exact same way. And those that seem to have more power actually don't really have that much more power. They have more influence. And so when they concede to behave in the way that they're meant to in that position, it will have bigger ripple out effects, essentially. And I think that's really important because it is going to be an all hands on deck situation to get through the polycrisis. And I don't think people have to be forgiven. I think there are certain people that should be nowhere near a position of power. You know, if I could wave a magic wand and like restructure the world. But I think that we have a human tendency to aggrandize what it is to be human. And ultimately, like, the only thing we have in common is a capacity to be utterly fallible, and to follow rather than lead. So we differ there. So in my worldview, I don't actually think that the threats of violence will have much of an impact on those people because there's not very much that they can do anyway. And like none of the companies, you know, in the US that are for-profit healthcare insurance, bloody whatever, have done anything in the wake of the murder of like the biggest paid guy. There will be another guy who, and his, you know, payday will be even bigger because the last guy got killed. I don't know how you trigger that sense of existentialism in people. And I don't know what you do if it is already triggered, but they feel like there's nothing that can be done anyway. And I imagine it will be the Earth's violence, although it's not really violence, but the Earth's capacity for destruction and her kind of like responding possibly as self-defense to the human project that will eventually crumble the systems enough, crumble centralized power enough, that in the rubble, if we have the right ideas lying around, we'll be able to build something different. But I don't think physical violence is going to be the thing, because it's not, this problem is not a single group of people. It's thousands and thousands and thousands of years of thought built on top of each other. So how do you kill a thought?
I guess what comes to mind for me because again, I don't disagree with anything you've said. There's just like another set of things that also feel true to me. Is like I watch how somebody like Donald Trump has managed to dodge accountability by weaponizing systems against themselves. Like he can be, a quote adjudicated rapist and still manage to hold, positions of power and sort of contort systems to his will. And part of that has to do with personal intimidation, like personally intimidating lawyers, witnesses, judges, and so on. So I agree with you that a system is like the weather. Like there's no individual place where the weather exists. And yet a weather system can have, serious impacts. And so I think about sure, Elon Musk in his role at Tesla, if he started talking about, being with his lunatic ravings of redistributing wealth, that his board would instantly depose him. But what if every one of those board members felt fear at the prospect of doing something like that and being visibly associated with doing something like that? That's not very many people. That's 20 people. Ballpark. I don't know how many people are on the Tesla board. And then you start to add up okay, what are all those companies? I think you could meaningfully say there's 500 people who, if they all felt scared to continue the systems that are causing harm to the other billions of people on Earth, that would accelerate change. My guess is that would accelerate change, positive change. And I that's a falsifiable hypothesis. And so then let's take it though as a hypothesis. Underneath that hypothesis is what are the mechanisms by which those people would feel individual fear to then actually create the behavioral change? If it's not going to come from empathy or fellow feel or a desire for the world to be better, because that's the part that always blows my mind is wow, you have so much power and you could be beloved, and you just keep choosing not to do it as an object lesson in how powerful that system is. So I guess I'd sort of pose that back to you is there are people with asymmetric power, and there's not very many of them ultimately. We know there's 800 billionaires, for example. And if they felt individual fear to do things that keep harming the earth, I just wonder if that wouldn't lead us where we need to go much more quickly.
Interesting. I think it would depend on the industry. I don't know, Zuckerberg. I don't think Facebook is exactly sort of central to the machinations of states still. So maybe he kind of still, his product still kind of exists as an overlay, as as a bonus essentially. So maybe in that case, but for the other ones, right? What does a deceleration look like? Because this is the other thing. If you terrify all of them and they go, oh, we have to do something, what is that something going to do? And this is always my kind of it's not my challenge to activists, because I think they're a really, really important point in the narrative, essentially, of pushing, we need to stop burning oil, we need to stop burning oil, we need to stop burning oil. But we do need oil. And if we don't have oil tomorrow, people die. Lots and lots and lots of people die. We are going to have to find a way to hospice modernity, to use Vanessa Andreotti's term, to dismantle it slowly. Because if it crashes and burns, then we're looking at the dislocation, essentially, of billions of people. Whether that's the fact that, pesticides are derived from fossil fuels and they dominate our food system, whether it's the fact that our supply chains are so complex now that everything depends essentially on transport and people don't have access to their own local food. So if we were to decelerate, it would need to actually be a kind of, how do I put this? The energy that we have available would have to be to go on renewable energy, say. But renewable energy is not really enough to power this planet, this society, rather. And so then those people who want to decelerate everything would have to be the people in charge of coming up with a new plan of what the new planet looks like and the new society looks like. And what's to stop them building into that very plan, the same power hierarchies, essentially just with a different energy source? And I do think it's very interesting that there's sort of suggestions of that with regards to the military decarbonizing, or individuals that are like very pro fossil fuels politically because it keeps us all trapped on centralized power, but then ensuring that their bunkers and their homes and their everything are fitted with renewable power and off grid so that if things go down, they'll be okay. So when you play it out, I think it really needs to be a collective decision. So I don't want those people decelerating. They would have to cause harm in the deceleration anyway in order to build the things that need to be built. And if they have all of the power of building the new thing, then who's to say whatever looks different would actually be at its core any different? And you also, I don't think you could have a situation in which those people, I don't know. I just don't think fear is the way to go. I really don't, And I don't want to be that person. I don't want to come off as a hippie. I think that there are lots of different kind of tactics. But I feel like any and every action which essentially serves to disempower those people and take some of that asymmetry away is the better option than essentially saying to them, well, we've asked nicely and you haven't done the thing, so now we're going to threaten you. If they feel threatened by that very society, they're definitely not going to code in equality into it when they're redesigning it.
It's a fair point.
That's my answer.
It's a fair point. Yeah, and the metaphor that I think about a lot is antibiotics, where to treat an individual infection, antibiotics are unquestionably effective, but in the long term, if they're ruining your biome, then maybe implicit in overdoing it is that you're setting yourself up for more pain in the future. On the other hand, sometimes you do have to take antibiotics, and so I default to that metaphor of ideally it's, peace, cooperation, coming to deeper levels of understanding, all that whole package, as hippie-ish as it might sound. I think that would be the ideal state. I mean, that's the fabled Star Trek future. But I also recognize that there have been moments historically where, meaningful change that feels net positive, which is hard to say, of course, with externalities and unintended effects, happen because of really bad, on the surface, momentary things. So I appreciate you engaging me on that topic.
It's a really important conversation that I think we should be having more of, frankly. So I'm glad that you kind of, raised it and pushed it. Yeah. Also, I just want to say, I don't think it's going to be the peaceful way. I think it's far more likely that, essentially the ecological disaster thing happens and we're like, oh no, what to do next? Maybe something nice. That would be good. Also, I do have one more thing to say. We have a very Western perspective, and we have to remember that there are other things going on around the world that are really good. Mexico elected a female climate scientist as its president, okay? And they are now doing some really good stuff. Colombia is actively trying to get off of fossil fuels. It's the first country in the world. So it's this very kind of doomed Western perspective to be like, oh no, the overlords are going to have to help us. Maybe we should hold a knife to their throats. There's 8 billion of us on the planet. We are the minority, those of us who live in white liberal democracies who are built on extractivism and violence. It may very well be that a coalition of political leaders comes out elsewhere and really does what is necessary. This could still be done through political channels, typical political channels. We face a crisis of imagination. There are other countries that are miles ahead of us with regards to confronting the reality. So, there's also that. I think it's really important to remember that.
Well, also, have you talked to Nora Bateson on Planet Critical?
No, I haven't.
Oh, sometime you really should. She's wonderful. But she talks about in complex systems, we're so obsessed with emergence that we forget to think about the thing that comes before emergence. And she coins a term for this, which is aphanipoiesis, which is meant to be sort of the positive valence of insidious, something that's so latent that it's happening but invisible. And by the time something is emergent, it's visible. but there's
Ooh,
stuff that's
fun.
happening kind of like down deep in the mud that you can't observe, but it is happening. And when I'm feeling especially when I'm in my sort of like doomer hole, I come back to that of like, I feel like there's a lot of us in the West, because of course we've had the luxury to not be awake for so long, who are waking up to that. And you know, I count myself in that number where I've long felt a commitment to social impact, but it wasn't until the past, let's call it 5 years, that I really started to confront, you know, the sort of utter mess of neoliberalism and the many different
Mm,
um, ways that neoliberalism expresses itself, or, you know, I guess maybe more accurately now, techno-feudalism expresses
mm,
itself in society. And so there is something to the idea that in addition to the political actions and things kind of taking place under the quote proper channels, I think there's also like more and more, like the fact that degrowth is both very popular but also very divisive. That feels like a
mm,
very good sign to me. The fact that there's this anti-work movement among, you know, Gen Alpha
mm-hmm,
and Gen Z feels very like all of those things. They're messy, but they feel very promising to me.
mm-hmm. I
Uh,
would agree.
yeah. Any I realized I was about to sort of change the subject, but I didn't mean to cut you off. Did
No,
you have
go.
more to
No,
say?
no, no, it's fine. I mean, no, no, no. I just, yeah, no, I agree.
Cool.
Feel free.
So we're recording this at the end of 2024, and I remember last year you did a really wonderful kind of like looking back, looking forward thing. I'm assuming you're doing something similar, but I'd also love to kind of like invite some of that in this conversation, which is like, are there things that you're kind of reflecting on from 2024 that either you hope persist in 2025, or that you hope, you kind of the classic in out thing, like in with whatever, out with whatever. Yeah. Any big hopes or you know, concerns about 2025, that whole thing.
Yeah. Concerned that 2025 will look like 2024, which is just sort of like an exponentially worsening ecological situation. Concerned about what Donald Trump is going to do as the president of the United States. I'm concerned about the rampant militarism through the West. It was the NATO chief who last week said that we need to be on a war footing. So I'm worried about war in 2025, more war. I'm worried that what was technically planted in 2023, but really ramped up in 2024, will be that our international institutions will be continued to sort of be made a farce of right at the time when they're kind of amping up and being ready to be deployed for climate. It's totally devastating that, you know, the United States, France, United Kingdom are ignoring the ICC's arrest warrants for Netanyahu and his cabinet, and essentially demeaning them, when also there are climate cases now coming to the ICC and making waves. So, you know, no, not great on a global picture for the world. I'm very concerned at the state of affairs, quite frankly, leading up to 2030. And I do think that things are going to get worse before they get better globally. And that is due to asymmetrical power, essentially, of Western democracies. Things I'm looking forward to are I'm launching a new project called Planet Coordinate, What to Do for a World in Crisis, where I'll be traveling around the global south, making films with my partner about communities that are responding to the crisis in some way, in an attempt to kind of like create the necessary other half of Planet Critical. You know, Planet Critical is a deconstruction, and it's quite intellectual and in the mind. You know, Planet Coordinate is going to be constructive and in the body, and about lived experience and about connecting the dots. You know, finding the, how do I put this? If Planet Critical is like the roots, then maybe Planet Coordinate's like the seeds of the future, hopefully. And to give people this idea that, like, you know, a new world is already here. You know, we don't all have to wait for our MLK or whatever. Like, we could all just start doing the things that need to be done together. So, yeah, my life is great, but the world is a shit show. How's that?
I feel that. I feel that.
Yeah.
Planet Coordinate sounds awesome. When will people start to see the fruits of those seeds?
So I would encourage, if anybody's interested, to subscribe and take out a paid subscription to support the project. Because right now it's the Planet Critical community that are supporting Planet Coordinate. I will be writing big features after every visit, essentially every community. So people can expect their first one, if not in January, then in February. And the first film will be released in spring, I imagine. That depends on my poor partner, who is the filmmaker and doing everything by himself. So I think spring is a fair deadline.
Amazing. Well, shout out to your partner for helping realize the vision.
Yeah.
I have 3 recurring questions that I like to ask every guest to close out these episodes. And so you've inevitably hit a number of things that could fit these questions. So feel free to draw those back in or take it somewhere totally different. What is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
Scientists. That would be nice. Their bodies, actually. Yeah. I wish people would pay more attention to their bodies, because I feel like the sort of collapse of mental well-being and even physical well-being in the Western world is symptomatic of part of our individual response to just how bad these systems are, not just for, the natural world or the global ecology, but also for us as people, as biological species. And I think that our bodies are really coded with knowledge that our bodies understand and know what our minds fail to grasp, essentially. And a lot of our language around understanding is like very, very physical and sensed. And so I think our alarm bells ring. Our alarm bells, as a woman, my alarm bells ring when like a dangerous man walks into a public space or a room. My alarm bells ring when I see, politicians lying on television, or when I see, the New York Times publish fucking nonsense. Like, my nervous system is responding to the amount of violence around me. And I think that that's happening for a lot of people. And I think it's a real shame that it sort of gets pathologized as like an inability to function. It's like, well, who wants to be able to function in all of this? It's a mess. So I wish people paid more attention to their bodies.
What is one resource you would recommend for making better sense of reality?
Planet Critical. Seriously.
I agree.
I would, highly recommend my work. I put a lot of work into it. And I say that because it's always a new guest every week, and they normally have books or podcasts or writing or whatever. So it's a kind of like exponential resource.
It's like asking the genie for more wishes or for infinite wishes.
Yeah, exactly.
And what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
In 2023, I went to Papua New Guinea to investigate carbon credits. And I came face to face with Emmanuel Macron. And I asked him a question, managed to sort of sneak into a press conference and ask him a question. And he gave like a fossil fuel line. And my body crowed with danger. And this is a story I tell in my sort of forthcoming in the sense that I'm writing it book. And it was actually a moment that disrupted reality, but in a really positive way, where I managed to understand more deeply that what is happening to the Earth's body is happening to my body. And I can use my body as a way of understanding and mapping that violence. And that as a woman, maybe there's something that I have to not only add to the conversation, to create community with regards to like, we know what danger feels like. And we know what dangerous men feel like when they walk into a room. And maybe, just maybe, we can tap into that when trying to understand what's happening with the world, trying to read all the news reports, trying to keep up with the science. Like, it's all too much. But maybe there's something instinctive and intuitive that is calling from deep within us when somebody lies to us, or when somebody makes a decision that's going to result in violence. Maybe, just maybe, we actually know what is going on. And that was a very powerful moment.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being on Urgent Futures. You've been very gracious with your time and our time difference. You brought up your book. Is there anything else you wanted to say about your book? Hints of release date, ideas, etc.?
Oh, no. No, it's still in the... I've got a wonderful agent. She's bloody great. We are in the final stages of the proposal writing, and then hopefully it will be sold. So that we're very far from a release date. But if everybody could wish me luck, that would be great, because writing a proposal is it's a tough slog.
Oh yeah, I have gone through that experience. It is a beast. Well, I'm wishing you luck.
Thank you.
And again, thank you so much for being on Urgent Futures. It's been a blast.
Thanks so much for having me, Jesse.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.